Hi, welcome back to the channel. Today we are talking about the most requested video that I've ever received, which is super cool. So this video is made for anyone who wants to take better, more interesting, and more unique board game photos overall. Now I have a quick 2 to 3 minute premise here. I was going to put all of this condensed into one video, but I'd rather give you a very strong, solid foundation to build upon by doing a series of videos instead of just one super short, condensed one that you're gonna forget probably in like the next week or so. So once you go through this entire series, which will be an ongoing series depending on what factors and what topics come up, but right now I'm estimating it's probably gonna be around like 5 episodes. But after all that, I guarantee you that you're gonna take better photos from the get-go. Now, regardless of what type of photographer you are, whether you're an amateur, enthusiast, professional, I know that you'll find something helpful and interesting. Even though it's tailored specifically to board game photography, which is essentially product photography, it's pretty much everything that I've learned in the past 3 to 4 years as a photographer, all condensed into these set of videos. And I am so excited to talk to you about those. I actually wrote a whole article about how board game photography made me a better photographer overall. So if that's something that you want to read, I will link it down in the description below. Now this series is going to be broken down into various parts based on what's inside the board game. So we'll start off with the board game box today. Next time we'll talk about the tokens and accessories. And then we'll dive into like the miniatures and like the cards as this series progresses on. And then after the board game components, I want to talk about the big major topics like lighting, like depth of field, like shutter speed, and maybe some more advanced techniques once we conceptualize all of these parts of the board game. So very cool. So I'll briefly list and talk about like different photo details like ISO, f-stop, shutter speed, and list all of those technical details. But I highly recommend that you watch this video first, which lays the foundation at least for the photography triangle before going into this video. And my last and final premise, as a rule of thumb, you want to make sure you thoughtfully plan, visualize, and think about how you're going to execute your shot. That way you have time to like order different items or find different things to accessorize and accent your shot. I'll show you how to do shoots both with a plan and without a plan, because that is how I take photos too. I don't always have a plan. So I'll teach you how to do it spontaneously, because realistically we don't have the opportunities and it's not as efficient to just plan every single shoot as you go. But the little caveat here is that when you do have a plan and you do have a vision beforehand and you're able to kind of storyboard what you're planning to do, you're more likely to increase the quality of your photo and to just make a better picture overall. Let me ask you this, would you rather have 1,000 photos of a meeple on a tabletop with just a blurry background, or one super high quality photo that will be on Kickstarter campaign pages and on people's phone as a wallpaper and framed in people's homes? If you're watching this video, you probably want to go over on this side, right? To do that, it takes planning. Let's get started. Let me scoot over to this side so I can properly talk about and discuss pictures that will be in the frame right here. So today we're talking about the box. One thing I've seen done often is to take a box and put it into a thematic setting, whether it's at a park, at a beach, or in front of like a monument that the game represents. And that's totally fine. It's great actually, because you're thinking really critically about how to stage this photo, which is great. However, we can take that up a notch. And what I also like to do is to add different items to accent the box in that case. So in Spirits of the Forest, I have it here in a park, and it would have looked fine if it was just sitting there with all like the leaves on the ground and all that nice foresty debris and just environment surrounding the box. It would look great because it fits nicely with Spirits of the Forest. The title and the theme and the box and the artwork, all that looks great. But what I also did here was I put a leaf right on top of the box and also a pine cone that kind of sits like nudging the box on the bottom side. So here, if you look at the bottom of the box art, what I was also thinking about is you see how like there are brown leaves on the bottom of the box. When you add in different items that kind of cover the box up a little bit, not only does it add depth, but it adds more characteristics to the box, and also it just makes it that much more interesting because there are things surrounding it and filling up that negative space, and that's what you want to do. But let's say you don't have a nice background. You are at home and you just want to stage the box art somewhere in the convenience of your home. Totally fine. So what I did here was, for the Valley of Alchemists, it was in the garage, and all I did was I put like a black cloth to just drape over the back so you can't see anything behind it, and it was a black table right underneath it. And then from there, I added in items to accent the box like I've been telling you. So in Valley of Alchemists, you have all these like potions, they call it decoctions, that are used in the game. And there are a variety of colors of them. So what I thought would be interesting was to take actual beakers that I have from my lab and to put like food coloring that matches the color of each of those individual decoctions and put it right in front. So you're matching real items to components in the game. And the kicker was to really think about how to thematize that game. So since this was all about chemistry, I figured I actually had my dad stand behind the box. He put on my lab coat, wore some blue gloves, and that was filling in that negative space, which was that black background. For Spirits of the Forest, it was a little bit flat because I had just the box, but I had items that were within the same plane. But for Valley of the Optimist, I started to expand that plane towards the camera and away from the camera, right? So my dad was away from the camera, filling in that negative space with the black canvas. And in front of the camera was when I was filling in all of those beakers that match the same colors as the decoctions. And all of those things, all of those items were all accenting the box art. So now let's switch it up again. Let's say you don't want a full-on straight front picture of the box art. What you can also do is angle it. The whole point of hats was because it was like an Alice in Wonderland theme and you're being invited to a tea party, which is why I wanted to include the actual envelope that was given to me to photograph the game, which looked really cool because it had like the old school seal on top of it. And then I put a camera next to it to kind of mimic that era in time. And then I put it, actually was across this table. This table beforehand was just brown before I wrapped it in like this black matted covering. So all that was done purposely. Because it was a brown envelope, I wanted to use other things that match that brown. That way it contrasts the blue purple of the box art. So you have a brown envelope, you have a brown table, and you have a brown candle holder at least. Box is shifted slightly, but you still see that it is the main subject because that's the main thing in focus. In Chai's latest expansion, High Tea, this one I also took it at a completely different angle. And this one, just to provide some variety, I took it on its side so you just see just this plane here, as you can see in this photo. And in the background, it was actually my kitchen and full of natural lighting. And I say this often, but you really have to understand how to play the game and the theme itself because that really is going to stimulate really creative ideas that match the photo that you're trying to take. So for Chai, for instance, what kind of feelings do you get by looking at this game? It's very lighthearted, it's very family friendly, and then what colors are you thinking of when you are imagining those colors, like white, yellow, very happy-go-lucky colors. So that's why I took it across natural lighting in the kitchen. And then it also helps to add some foreground to it. So I used pieces from the game, which were the teacups, the brown teacups. Those were juxtaposed at different depths. So one was closer to the lens, one was, I would say, like a foot away from the lens. And then we have the payoff. And when I say payoff, that means where your eyes are traveling to reach that end goal. So that payoff is the box art itself. And to add a little bit more interest and to not make it so flat, I added in the dice up top. But for the dice, you have a choice, right? You have 6 sides to choose from. And it's always good to think about these little details. So for me, I chose a strawberry and I chose a honey because the red and the brown really provides a really nice stark contrast and accents the box. I love how red just stands out, but it's not overpowering the image. It's just a tiny little accent to kind of give you like a little preview about what components are inside this game. Now let's say you want to take a picture of your box in your studio. This is a great exercise in lighting. And for my style in particular, I love dramatic lighting. I always use dramatic lighting across a lot of my pictures because that's just my style. And in particular, I really like it because it really makes your subject stand out while eliminating everything else. On top of that, dramatic lighting builds tension, which is why I like to post these pictures in anticipation before the final video to build up all of that excitement. And another reason why I like it is because it just gives your subject so much more depth. So here is a photo of how it looks like with dramatic lighting. And here's the same photo without dramatic lighting. So see how boring and flat and one-dimensional that looks? So for Monumental, to achieve that look, what I did was I put it right on top of the shelf. And you see how I have a light here? So this is actually a Yongnuo light. I've talked about this many times, but basically it's a great light. I highly recommend it. Portable, you can use it for any kind of color. It's my favorite photography item and I use it pretty much daily. So I'll leave the links to that down below. By the way, it is a version 2 because the version 2 comes with its own battery. It's a lot more convenient than version 1. I will show you how to do it with a stand, but my microphone is using it currently. But I had a microphone stand that was right above it, right over here. So I know it's a bit out of frame, but the light was pretty much being held right above your subject. So this right here is what gives that dramatic lighting effect because it's just one single light source. But then you want to give it a little bit more depth and to separate it from the wall, which is why I put one more light right behind it here, as you can see in the photo that I'll show right here. And there was one final thing that I did, which you can guess by now, trying to get that pattern in your head to just constantly accent your your subject. In this case, it's the box. So one last thing I did was I added in the miniatures from Monumental. And I even did it in a specific order because I used the tallest miniature, which was Genghis Khan, and I put him right in the middle, and it formed kind of like this triangle effect. So that way your eyes are kind of just going from the top of the photo where the light starts and going down. And as you're gazing down through the photo, you're going from the right because of the mountain kind of peak that I'm forming here, and then to the left, and then down to the box itself. That's why you always want to keep in mind leading lines and always making sure that what you're accenting to the photo makes sense. And this is a very simple one, right? We just have one light in the back, one light up top, miniatures on top of the box. That's it. So to summarize, we talked about having the box in a single plane, but then giving it different objects to accent it, like the leaves in Spirit of the Forest. But if you don't have a nice background and you just want to take a photo at home, you can also just use a black background and then add different layers in terms of what's closer to the lens and what's further away from the lens, and probably like your box in the middle, in order to accent the box. So different items that match the theme of the box are really important. Like for Valley of Alchemists, I added in all those potions and decoctions. All those colors are all matching what items that are being stored in the box. But overall, we're not losing sight of what our main subject is, which is the Valley of Alchemists cover art. Third example was to be able to shift your box at different angles. Maybe you don't want a direct confrontation of the box art, and instead you want to lay it on the side like I did for Chai High Tea. Or maybe you want to angle it a little bit with hat and then fill in the negative spaces with different things that match the era of time that it's being staged in. If you just want to take it in your studio, I showed you how to do that with one single light source and also another light source behind it. The single light source would be the main key light, and then the hair light would be the light that's behind it. And the last example that I want to show you today that I think I will make the thumbnail for this video is how to do this live. So this one was spontaneous, it wasn't planned at all. And what I did was I went out to my backyard. I'll overlay a clip over here. So here I have my camera pointed at the Fuji Coral box, and then I also have it set on a timer because you are doing long exposure. Ideally, you do want to use a remote to make sure you eliminate any kind of shakiness. And then if I decrease the brightness on here, you can see that the box is fully in focus. What I'm gonna do is I want to plant some of the figurines right in front right here, and then use a higher f-stop. That way the box is also in focus. And then I'm also going to, obviously with proper gear and everything, use some steel wool and recreate that lava floor as if like the characters are running towards the camera still with the lava floor effect. Okay, so here's a fun little trick. What you can do is you tap on your focus here for your DSLR, and then you go over to your lens and then you switch off autofocus so it goes onto manual focus. That way your camera isn't hunting back and forth when you're doing the shot. Secondly, so when you're trying to compose all of your board game pieces, what you want to do is fill up all that negative space and add some layers as you are centering around your subject. So even though the main subject actually is the box art, which I do want in focus somewhat, the box is so big. I'm going to actually focus here on the first miniature right up front, since he is the cover of the box right there. So I'm actually using the same characters in the same order shown here. The thing is, I'm also juxtaposing them so that way they are at different layers. So see how you have one layer in the front, and then you have a little bit blurrier here, even more blurrier here, and the blurriest right here. So you have leading lines going that way all the way towards your finisher, which is the box. Now you see here, there's still a lot of negative space. All that orange right there is definitely negative, but that's totally fine. I kind of want to play with it and see how much of the floor I can cover with the steel wool before I add more lava. I might add a little bit more lava. I might add a little bit more lava in that little corner right there and the back corner right here. But still, I want to make a lot of room when I'm scraping that steel wool across the floor, which is why I'm leaving all that negative space right here. The whole point of this is to escape a volcano. And there's only one way to recreate that, and that was to somehow incorporate fire into the base layer of the photo. Ideally, I wanted like different parts of a volcano spewing out, or at least to have that kind of effect, right? And for me, what I thought of was to use steel wool. So steel wool photography, you have to be careful by the way when you're using this. Make sure you're using proper gear, goggles, gloves, and so forth when you're using this. But with long exposure photography, which I'll cover in a completely different video, but with long exposure photography, what's happening is that you're using your camera to just keep the lens open for several seconds. So this one actually I think ended up being 20 seconds long. And what happens with that is that it's going to let in as much light as possible, which is why you're able to take such a bright photo at night. because it's letting in all the light from every light source, from like street lamps to like the moon to every source of light possible. So in like this BTS here, you see nothing but just pitch black, right? But then you'll see orange sparks that I've made from scraping all of that steel wool back and forth. And then I wanted to do something different here. Arguably the subject actually might end up being the miniatures, but I wanted to make the box art way more subtle because it's such a big prominent box. So I put that in the background, I added in the lava tiles right beneath them. And it wasn't just like a flat single layer of lava tiles, right? I also added some tiles that put 2 on top of each other, some tiles that put 3. So you want to give some variety to that as well. Because if you just put one single layer, you're just recreating the ground at that point. So that's why I put in 2 to 3 lava tiles at some points, and then I moved the samurai so that way they're at different depths, different locations, different distances away from the camera. But the final kick here, it was to fill in that negative space, right? It would have looked okay with just the lava and with just the miniatures and the box art, but the steel wool is the main accent here, which is why I used it so prominently. So the biggest takeaway about board game photography, one that I'm going to hark on for the next couple of videos, is to really understand your game, play the game, and make sure you understand the story, make sure you are conceptualizing and matching what the theme is about. Why? Because that is your pool of ideas. If you want to have some ideas about how to stage your picture, play the game. Play the game, read the story, read the background story, and that's going to give you a ton of ideas on how to recreate it. At the end of the day, your photo has to make sense. Imagine if I took chai high tea and I did the same thing with steel wool photography. That would make no sense, right? Because it has nothing to do with tea. The vibe and the aura is completely different. Like imagine if I just did like a smoke bomb over it and stuff, it would make no sense. And it actually would detract away from the feelings and like the impact of your photo if you don't pair it correctly, right? If you do something epic with a game that's lighthearted, it just would completely sap the impact of your photo. And that is episode 1 of how to take the best board game photos in terms of the box art that we covered today. In the next episode, we'll talk all about the most difficult part of board game photography, which are cards. So if you have any questions, feel free to let me know down in the comments below about anything you want me to cover, anything you want me to address, or if you just like the video, let me know. So I want to finish today, and actually I want to maybe start including this in later videos, but I've been getting a lot of questions lately about photography, and I wanted to finish today by just reading off some questions from Instagram. So I'll link all of that right here. But a question that was asked by Borden and Charlotte was, what's your favorite visual technique for photos and how does it enhance its story? This is one of the best questions I've ever gotten, and it's super thoughtful, so thank you for taking the time to ask this. But I would say my favorite go-to technique is definitely long exposure. The reason for that is because you're able to manipulate elements in a way that A, you can't see, and B, in ways that they've never been captured before. So for example, when you use like a lighter, you'll see the flame just kind of pop up like poof, and you just see it waving around. But for photography, when you use long exposure, you'll see all those streaks of fire kind of just waving, and it's just captured into one still image. And that's one way you can really make your photos interesting, especially if you are at home. Because we're so limited by our environment here, we have to figure out ways to make things interesting. And long exposure is definitely one go-to visual technique that I use for a lot of my photography actually. It's not just fire, right? Fire, water, light, a lot of really cool elements can be used with long exposure, and I love that. So that's definitely my go-to visual technique. So thank you for asking, Borden and Charlotte. Next up, question by Bulls and Boards was, what's the best way to light board game shots? Great question. So I did talk about one when I did the box for Monumental. Typically, I just use natural lighting. I'll do an entire video on this so you're aware of all those techniques that I use. But in general, I usually use natural lighting. So like next to a windowsill or during sunset. If I were to use artificial lighting, it would be that light right there. Just using one single source of light to recreate the dramatic lighting effects that I talked about earlier. And yeah, I don't go too crazy with light sources because I just like natural light better. But if I do use artificial light, then it would be like 1 or 2 light sticks. That's pretty much it. But I will have a comprehensive guide on lighting in a video coming up soon. So thank you for asking, Bulls and Boards. And my last question for today is from Dystopian Serenity. So this one was, how can you take a good close-up photo with a really old iPhone? Any tips? Wonderful question. I actually took a majority of my pictures with just iPhone 6 Plus back in the day, before I even got a camera or into photography. To answer your question, I will also do an entire video about this because these are such big, heavy topics, and I'd rather show you a ton of examples so you have a ton of information to work off of. But I would actually avoid portrait mode on your phone because portrait mode has a minimum distance that you can take for your photos. And it doesn't work as well, especially for board game shots, because you have to get really, really close. So I would just use the native camera app. Don't worry, I'll show you photos that are 10 times better when I do a full video on how to take pictures with your phone. But you want to get as close as you can to your subject, and our phones allow us to do that pretty well. And then from there, make sure you click on the part that you want to highlight and the part that you want to accent. So typically, it's like the eyes in your miniatures. That's where you want to accent. And when you click on it, you'll see a little symbol of like the sun popping up. And what I like to do is to actually decrease that a little bit so you're able to manipulate that a little bit more in post. And a lot of my tips for phone photography actually come in the edit. What I don't like about our phones is that they oversaturate our image, and the only way to adjust for all that color saturation is to use a different app, like a third-party app. But that was a quick little tip to answer your question. I'll do an entire video on this in the future. And until next time, thank you all for asking questions. Feel free to ask me any more because I'll include them in the next video. And I will see you all in episode 2.